Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen. 5 weeks ago, we introduced humans as descendants of an ancestor we have in common with the chimps, gorillas, and orangutans of today, and the Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other hominids of the past. Over the past 3 weeks, we've looked at how our ancient ancestors began to develop a soul, or at least something that our guest referred to as soulishness, and a morality and the first hints of a religious streak. Last week, we looked at that religious streak developing in a big way in Neanderthals and modern humans, a couple 100,000 years ago. How we developed capacities for symbolism and abstract thought. We started burying our dead in a way that suggested a belief in the afterlife. We made flutes, a clear sign of music, which has always been deeply spiritual for humans throughout recorded history. We made statues of what could have been deities or gods, and we showed compassion. Today we want to look at another step in our evolution towards becoming those agape-capable beings. How we develop some cognitive abilities, neural pathways, and behaviors, which together are a powerful engine for sensing deities and creating religious beliefs. More on that in a moment. First, let me introduce our guest. Dr. Justin Barrett is a leader in the cognitive science of religion, which draws on psychology, neurology, sociology, and even paleontology. And it asks questions like, why do we see recurring patterns of cultural expression which you might call religious across all human cultures through history? Why do humans keep talking about God and looking for gods? Why do we so frequently see ritualized behaviors, belief in the afterlife, and the idea of a soul? Dr. Barrett has a PhD in experimental psychology from Cornell University and 120 scientific publications to his name, most of which look at the science behind religion. He also has had millions of dollars in grant funding and many awards, fellowships, recognitions, and distinctions. But more than just published in the area, he's been a leader and a vision caster. When he was on faculty at Oxford University, he helped start the Center for Anthropology and Mind, as well as the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology. More recently, he joined Fuller Theological Seminary to develop and lead the Thrive Center for Human Development in their School of Psychology, as well as the Office for Science, Theology, and Religion Initiatives. And then, just a few years ago, he left academia and founded Blueprint 1543, an organization which seeks to foster engagement between the sciences and theology. Dr. Barrett, thanks for coming onto the podcast. It's really great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Luke.
I'm so glad that you took up the invitation. Some of the things that we talk about today might be challenging, even threatening to some believers. So I think it would be good for them to know that you yourself are coming at this from the position of being a Christian believer yourself. So can you tell us a bit about what that looks like?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a believer. I consider myself even an evangelical, but I don't have any particular denominational loyalty. I've been part of Church of England when I lived there. I grew up in Baptist churches, most recently been part of a Presbyterian church. And when I lived in California for 9 years, I was part of a charismatic church. So you can see
you've covered a lot of ground.
A little bit of theological breadth there, yes. But I'm a fairly orthodox kind of believer and have been most of my life, though I guess some of my friends would question my orthodoxy on some particular issues. But I think in general, I'm part of the mainstream of the evangelical movement.
Okay. And it's part of your daily and weekly rhythm, I gather.
Yeah, that's right. I view the science work that I've done. I view even the launching of this new organization, Blueprint 1543, as just a working out of my faith, my obedience, my calling before God, and the part of His kingdom work that I get to participate in. So this is just, my faith is the structure of how I try to live my life.
Okay. And maybe very briefly introduce us to Blueprint 1543.
Yeah, Blueprint 1543 is a new little organization that I have co-founded with Rebecca Dorsey. And we do coaching, consultation, convening, and catalyzing of projects around the area of the Christian faith and the sciences to try to address big questions in life, especially concerning human flourishing. So we work with academics, project leaders, funding bodies, and other organizations to try to develop projects in these areas so that hopefully we see more believers, Christians, Christ followers who are excited about the sciences and excited about using the sciences as tools for better theology and better ministry.
And so do you speak in churches, or is this exclusively in seminaries and other academic settings?
I do a little bit of church speaking. I've done recently at a couple of churches, but mostly I'm a project and program developer at this point, as well as doing some of my scholarship on the side. So my speaking is, I'm trying to back off of that, a little bit less of me and more of the projects we're trying to develop. But when, I've written a new book, people want to talk about it. And occasionally I get to talk about my cognitive science of religion work as well.
Now, you've been in science almost as long as you've been a Christian, and you've been able to keep the two together. How have you done that? Did you not find a constant tension between science and scripture?
Was certainly not a tension between science writ large and scripture. As far back as I can remember, the exploration of the natural world for me was a gateway into seeing God's creativity, his inventiveness, his sustaining and creative power in the world around us. I've always just seen sort of the deep appreciation of the natural world and its complexity and how it works as testimony to God's power and goodness. So not in a broad sense, but have there been sort of narrower instances where I'm like, well, I don't know how this bit of science fits with my understanding of scripture or my understanding of theology? Well, sure. The easy one that I think everybody goes to is maybe human evolution.
Right.
That one took a long time for me to warm up to the idea that the idea of human evolution and common descent was then commensurate with a good sort of robust view of biblical authority and an understanding of at least traditional views of the inheritance of sin and so forth. So that took me a while to piece all of that together and to feel some degree of comfort. It wasn't until I was probably even had finished my doctoral degree that I started to feel comfortable. Now it was a process, but so there have been those tension points for sure, and there are these recurrent moments where, oh, there's this new finding, Justin. Have you heard about this? Well, how do you square that with? And then I look into it a little more and I think hard and I talk to friends who know it better than I do and try to come up with some account for how these go together. And the more I've done that and the more that I've seen success in doing that, then I go, okay, there's not really anything to be afraid of here. Right. Eventually, truth wins out, I guess.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad you've got it all worked out, because that's why we've got you on today. We're going to ask you a few questions about human evolution, or at least human cognitive evolution. But before we get into the heart of today's topic, it would be good to establish how we humans form our beliefs. We want to think we hold them through reason, that we think it through and make a conscious, informed choice. But I've heard you say there's a little bit more behind embracing a belief statement or even a whole belief system.
Yeah, that's right. We do have this kind of idealized view of our belief forming that somehow we sit around, as disinterested intellects, sort of evaluating the evidence and reaching a conclusion. But that's not what research in the science of belief formation shows us. What it seems to be suggesting is that most of the beliefs and belief-like states we have that help us navigate the world around us are formed fairly automatically without much conscious attention at all. They just sort of are delivered to us in an almost immediate, we say non-inferential way by our senses, by our intuitions, by our emotions even. And so you might think of that as your fast your fast system. We sometimes it's convenient. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's convenient to talk about our sort of fast cognition and slow cognition, or system 1, system 2 kind of. This
is Daniel Kahneman.
The Kahneman kind of thinking fast, thinking slow, dual processing theory, it's sometimes called. And what all of these models are trying to get at is there's a lot of how we think, including belief formation, that just seems to happen automatically. It happens outside of our conscious awareness to a large extent. And then there is the slowed down, reflective, we sometimes say executive function kind of work that we do when we're really thinking through things in a step-by-step manner. But what we don't want that distinction to lead one to think is that those two ways of thinking are completely separable. They're not. As philosophers like to say, we reason from things to other things, right? We don't reason from nowhere. We start with premises. We start with sense impressions. We start with intuitions. Even the most sort of careful deductive reasoning starts from somewhere, right? And likewise, when we form our beliefs, we start from the stuff that fast system is throwing up. I don't mean vomiting. I mean, it's producing. They're emerging right from what you might think of as our intuitive system. And these intuitions, emotions, and so forth, percepts, then are accepted as likely to be the case unless we come up with reasons to adjust them while we're doing that rationally. And I don't see anything wrong with that. Just, I'm not laying out that model as a criticism. That's just how we work. And it's hard to see how it could work otherwise, right? I have an impression that my mother loves me, for instance. Well, I don't reason to that idea that my mother loves me. I have the impression that my mother loves me. And then if somebody challenges me on that, I might go, okay, well, here's the evidence. But I actually arrived at the belief before the evidence in some ways, at least reflectively. Likewise, with a lot of our moral judgments, it seems to be that we arrive at them sort of immediately and then have to backfill the reasons. And it sure looks like a whole lot of our beliefs are of that sort. They're formed in this non-reflective kind of way and then only become reflective under certain circumstances. Are you with me?
Oh, absolutely. And can we say the same thing applies for people who claim they have no faith system, no beliefs? Is that also for them? Are they purely making a conscious, informed choice, or are they also deferring to these intuitions and biases?
We all have certain kinds of intuitions and biases that we're going to draw upon.
And they're subconscious.
Now, they often are subconscious. Sometimes we can make these conscious, we can elicit them, but we're not always very good at that, right? We don't know our true selves and our true thoughts all the time. So it's tough work. That doesn't mean we don't reason to some of these positions. And in fact, I've argued before that I think it takes special circumstances and maybe special people with intellects to reason themselves away from religious beliefs, because religious beliefs are more intuitive. They're the path of least resistance in some ways. And so we would expect to see an association between careful reasoning and a rejection of common beliefs, common religious beliefs. But that would be true of any sort of popular or common cultural beliefs we have around us. It's harder to be the outlier. Right. It takes a little bit more intellectual work to be an outlier, whether good, bad, or indifferent. Right. It's harder to believe in a flat earth at this point than to believe in a round earth.
Okay. So now let's get to the heart of the matter. You're a cognitive scientist. You study how people think and how they justify or hold their belief systems. And I've heard you talk about these two cognitive abilities, cognitive modes of processing that are important in generating those non-reflective beliefs you were just talking about. And the first I want to hear about is this ability or tendency to detect agency, and what you've sometimes referred to as the hyperactive agency detection device.
Sure, yeah. So we know that some of the most important things in the world around us for human beings are other humans, but also other kinds of objects that move themselves in purposeful ways. Let's call those objects agents. Okay, those objects that launch themselves, that they moved. They initiate action. They don't merely respond to the world around them. And there are plenty of experimental studies showing that it doesn't take a lot for the human mental cognitive system to see an object as an agent. We need to see it launch itself or act in a way that is not based on being contacted physically. It needs to move in a goal-directed way, and that's about it. So you can put two-dimensional discs on a computer screen and have them move in the right way, and suddenly we see them as agents with minds, with intentions, beliefs, desires, maybe even personalities. It does not take much to get us going. When our computer behaves in a way that we don't like or appreciate, then we might start yelling at it, thinking that it has a mind. Before our desktop computers, we would do that to our cars, right? If the car is not, say, hey, what's wrong with you? What do you have against me today? We do this with animals. We do this with all kinds of things. That tendency has sometimes been called anthropomorphism. But I've worked it out in terms of agency detection, because there are lots of perception scientists who say, yeah, People like Brian Scholl, at Yale, who has produced evidence that it seems to be an automatic perceptual property of certain objects that we detect them as agents. Why does that matter? Well, it looks like that system can get going with very little encouragement, right? I said all we need is these two-dimensional disks that are moving in the right way. Well, sometimes we don't even need to see the objects. We can see the consequences of objects' agency. We can hear certain sounds and we assume automatically, hey, that's an agent, as our, again, intuitive default that then we need to override or accept. So for that reason, I've called it this. The first term was supposed to be a joke. The ADD with hyperactivity was the agency detection device. I've since started calling it hypersensitive agency detection device.
Note the subtle difference between detecting an agent and detecting agency. The doer and the doing.
And sometimes I even drop the hypersensitive part because, strictly speaking, we don't know when it's accurate or not. What we know about the system is it's easily triggered. That's right. What we know.
And this is also behind us seeing faces in clouds or in random patterns on the ground. And I also heard you say that babies are born with this.
Babies selectively attend to human faces right out of the womb. They're paying attention to that. They are, at least there's evidence within, I believe it's down to about 5 months of age that babies are distinguishing and reacting differently to agents versus non-agents. Again, even if they don't look like human beings, even if they're just two-dimensional displays on computer screens. So yeah, this seems to be an early developing, just automatic kind of system that's baked into human cognition.
And then as those children grow up, they continue to work with this agency detection. They look at their parents and they begin to ascribe properties to those parents. I heard you talk about how children see their parents, and I know I did this. You see your parents as omniscient and even omnipotent, and then once you become teenagers, you revise your theology there. But
yeah, so once we detect that a being is an agent, then we're going to that triggers what we sometimes call our theory of mind system, or sometimes called the mentalizing system, or mind reading. There are lots of terms that are used in the science on this. But what all of them are trying to capture is we attribute mental states to these agents. That help account for how they behave, help predict and explain how they behave. What does it want? What's it trying to do? Why is it doing it that way? And of course, we do this with people. We do this with our dogs and cats that are around us. We might even do this with remote control cars and computers. And yeah, kids are doing that. And it seems that developmentally, there are some sort of easy default modes with what we attribute to others, like it's easier to attribute to our parents that they kind of know everything. And so we do until we learn otherwise. I assume mom knows that what I've got hidden in my pocket until I can get evidence otherwise. And you can see that that's computationally simple. It's easier to assume others know everything, and then I ratchet that back, than trying to figure out exactly where someone's been, what their visual access was to something, were they under the right conditions to learn this, right? Building all of this up from the ground up is very difficult. It's a lot easier to just flip the switch to mom knows everything. And so the evidence seems to point in at least something like that direction.
Right. And then where I'm going with this is then we continue to grow up with this had. I'm going to refer to it as a had. We grow up with that, and then that may be playing into where people will talk about how they can sense God's presence. Or I'm also wondering if this ties into when people stand in front of the Grand Canyon or a rainforest ecosystem, or even when I look at the genetic code, and I look at that and I think there's got to be something behind this.
Right. I think those examples from viewing nature are getting closer to what Deborah Kellerman has called promiscuous teleology, or teleofunctional reasoning, which is not unrelated. It's related in the following way, that because agents are so important in the world around us, it's very easy for us to also see different events, the construction of things, as being the consequence of agentive action, that those agents have done something, maybe for a particular purpose or function.
We'll come back in a moment to promiscuous teleology. I just wanted to finish this, how we, as we grow up, we indulge in this agency detection system. And people will talk about how they sense God's presence, or they'll talk about having a personal relationship which they base on feelings. And is this part of that whole had?
Well, that's right. We get used to using things like feelings, senses, intuitions, but also perceptual experiences as evidence that there's someone around. And sometimes that leads us to a search of who that someone is. And if it doesn't seem to be triggering a detection of a known, regular natural agent like a human or an animal, then we have to make some kind of attribution as well. Well, then who is that? And if we learned that maybe through worship services or something else, take that as signs of God, then that's where our mind goes, because we automatically detect agency. And now we just need to label, well, what is the source of that agency, or who is the agent? If God is a good candidate, great. It could be a ghost, though, a spirit, an ancestor, right? It depends on, in some ways, the context.
Okay. So that's the first of these internal systems that we have. I think you've referred to them as inference generating systems. They inform that subconscious, those biases and those intuitions that we develop. And then you referred to a second inference generating system, and that was the promiscuous teleology. So let's now talk about that. And again, reminding the listeners that this is now a separate system, separate from the had.
Yeah, that's right. So there's reason to think that from early childhood, children look around the world and they see the features of the rocks and rivers and animals, and maybe even the existence of animals, rocks, mountains, and rivers themselves as the result of some kind of design or purpose, that they've got a function. So kids are attracted to explanations for features of the natural world in terms of what's it for. Deb Kellerman, in some of her, she's a developmental psychologist at Boston University. In some of her earliest studies, she showed that kids like explanations for, why rocks are pointy, so animals won't sit on them and smash them, right? It's for a reason that they're pointy. They don't like mechanistic explanations like, because bits of stuff piled up over time, and that's why the rock is pointy. She's subsequently shown that, those kind of teleological explanations or purpose-based explanations are still attractive to us all the way through adulthood, unless we get sort of educated out of them. Okay, so we get taught, maybe through formal education, that's not the right way to think of these. No, we really like just mechanistic explanations. It seems that the natural, again, conceptual path of least resistance is to think in terms of, what's it for? And that not only applies to artifacts like tables and chairs, it applies to mountains and rivers. And that purpose then helps account for, why it's here. Why? So she's, demonstrated that you can pretty closely, spontaneously get out of kids explanations for why is there a river? Well, so that we have a place to go fishing. Why are there monkeys in the forest? Well, so that there's something in the trees to, make us laugh. These kinds of explanations seem to be, again, what we're attracted to. We try to find purpose everywhere.
Right. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, with Jeffrey Schloss, we were talking about the purposes, the functions of religion. And one of the things that has been proposed, I think we had 7 or maybe 8 of the proposed functions of religion, was to come up with explanations. And so now we're talking about that again here today. Is this behind God of the Gaps explanations or intelligent design? Is this promiscuous teleology behind those two ways of thinking?
Well, it's certainly the case that if this account is correct, if we've got a natural propensity to sort of seek out and favor design and purpose in the natural world, then we've got kind of a whodunit. And we're trying to find out, who's the suspect that accounts for this purpose best? And in contexts in which we don't have gods or spirits or whatever to do that work, there's a real temptation then to sort of insert them into those explanatory gaps, because it just seems like we've got a conceptual open question, and that creates dissonance. It makes us uncomfortable. So I'll note that not only does this account for a sort of God of the gaps or any other kind of natural spirits kind of explanation of how things are or why they are the way they are, but also why it is that we will see people who are even naturalists. They reject the existence of all of these supernatural agents. They'll show tendencies to distort, say, evolution by natural selection, to give it a little bit more agentive oomph, It accounts for everything. It gives us meaning in life. It explains our morality. Evolution has purpose. We'll start hearing that kind of language leaking through. Why? Well, we feel this sort of pull toward purpose, and we need an agent. And if we've rejected God, something's got to get squished into that space.
I'm not just pointing fingers at other people. I'll be vulnerable. Part of my own personal belief system is that it's more intellectually satisfying to believe that there's meaning and purpose in the universe, and we're not just here by accident. Now, I don't have any proof of this. I don't have any proof against it. I just prefer to believe that it's there. Purpose and meaning in the universe are there. And I just want to play on the team that's working toward ultimate meaning and purpose and good. So am I being naive? Am I indulging that promiscuous teleology inside of me?
Well, I think those are different questions, right? If you're doing it naively, then you're being naive, right? No. So I guess the question that raises for me is, why would we think that we should be automatically suspicious of this tendency to want to see meaning and purpose? Just because it's got a natural impetus doesn't mean we should reject it out of hand, right?
Right.
And in fact, usually we think just the opposite, that those things that are common natural intuitions are, well, they're our starting point. They're where we should start. They're what we give a benefit of the doubt to, like those things like my mom loves me. Well, that's a pretty, basic kind of thing that came out. Well, I should give my mom the benefit of the doubt, it seems to me, instead of being skeptical of it just because there's a natural story to tell about it. So no, I don't think that's that impulse is naive. I think it's just part of what it means to be human, and I think we should take those seriously. And you're not alone in this, right? So my colleague, Jesse Bering, who works in cognitive science of religion as well, he's very public about the fact that he's an atheist, and he studies fellow atheists. And he says it's really hard to be a good, consistent atheist who doesn't see any meaning and purpose in the world. He has documented how other atheists see meaning and purpose in lots of different events and so forth in ways that, at least he says, don't square with their atheism very well. But it seems to build off of this tendency to see purpose around us.
Right. Okay. So now let's put those two together, those two inference generating systems that are operating in the background subconsciously. One, always trying to identify agency at all levels, agents that we can see and agents that we can't see. So answering the who question. And then the second one, always looking for the story, the meaning, the purpose behind it. In other words, the why and the how questions. And when you put those two together, that's a powerful tool for creating religious belief systems. Someone or something out there, even out of sight, operating around us, doing things.
Yeah, I think you've got that right. We see design and purpose. We wonder what things mean. We wonder why events happen. And thinking in terms of agents is a very easy and natural place for us to go. And so it's easy to conjoin those two. We also have a very early developing recognition that most of these kinds of whodunits cannot be answered by human beings. Humans don't make rivers and mountains. Humans don't account for why it is that a loved one dies suddenly and unexpectedly, or why that person who seems to be immoral seems to have been punished. Often we can't appeal to human agency to answer those whodunits. And so we need something else. And gods of the right properties can play that role nicely.
And so those two systems in the background, again, they're not working in isolation or in parallel. They're acting synergistically and in series, and the one amplifies the other, as I understand.
That's right. Those, among other kinds of systems, that can also nudge in these same directions. They're part of the bigger story, but important parts, I think.
Right. And then this, I'm going to ask you, this is behind what we see religions all around the globe through every period in recorded history. Adherence from every slice of the demographic pie, doesn't matter about gender, wealth, education, nationality, or race. There's no demographic slice that's immune to this.
That's right. If this is part of our regular human cognitive equipment, then we're going to see shades of this everywhere. That doesn't mean each and every individual, of course, will be religious. We know that's not the case. But I sometimes think of it this way. I compare it to like the tendency to dance, if I can use that example. We know that humans are, well, at least we have strong reason to think humans are the only sort of spontaneous rhythm movers. We move rhythmically with others in groups, for instance. When music comes on, a 2-year-old will start moving in rhythm. maybe bad rhythm, but they'll try. They do what you might think of as proto dance. And there are all of these little cognitive and psychological mechanisms that seem to make dance a really easy thing for us to do. And so we see that unless a culture has worked really hard to suppress dance, it's there in every culture throughout time.
Right.
That doesn't mean everybody grows up to be a dancer, but it does mean that, at least on the cultural or group level, we've got strong natural propensities toward dance. Likewise, or analogously, we seem to have strong natural propensities to believing in the existence of one or more what you might call gods who help account for the design and purpose in the world we see around us, make meaning of certain kinds of events, maybe account for why bad things happen to bad people and good things to good people, or whatever we want to account for.
Right.
So yes, these seem to be the building blocks of religion and why these systems we call religious are so cross-culturally recurrent.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Warren Brown told us about the emergence of soulishness in humans in the normal development of babies into adults. He was a bit hesitant to say too much about this same thing happening in ancient hominids evolving into modern humans. Let's talk about the had and this promiscuous teleology. Do you see these as part of that soulishness, and do you see this as an evolutionary development? And that might be certainly behind what we see, Babylonians, Stonehenge, Mayans, and Aztecs. But even going further back, we find statues of what we might assume are idols or gods or divinities. I think as much as 30,000 years ago, even as far as Siberia, they find these little gods, these little statues.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about not reading too much into the past, but I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, at least, that as our ancestors developed these sort of massive prefrontal cortexes that we have. That's the part of the brain right behind your forehead, behind your eyes, in front of your ears, which seems to play a really important role in things like thinking about agents, thinking about design and purpose, and thinking about thinking, importantly, sort of taking us offline to evaluate things. All of those, what are sometimes called executive functions, that are subserved by that great big forehead that we modern humans have, but our ancestral kind of great apes don't have so much of. As that emerges, then we have this opportunity to think imaginatively about these whodunit problems. Maybe this promiscuous teleology actually evolves in part because of its ability to facilitate tool use, for instance, which plays an important role in the evolution of our species as well. Harnessing fire, building tools, then being able to, obtain, more animal proteins and fats, which then help build bigger brains, because you need that kind of calorie, nutrient dense kind of material, but you need to be able to cook a lot of that stuff to keep it safe. So you see a feedback mechanism and then that build these big brains that then help us to be better at these reflective and also these social kinds of interactions that again put emphasis on the agency system. So you start seeing an evolutionary complex that may have sort of gotten off the ground, who knows, a couple million years ago, but really started hitting its stride 300 to 200,000 years ago. And so it's quite possible that we see that there's that proto-religious kinds of impulses go back at least that far. We don't have any strong material evidence of such things.
Sure. Okay, so let's take a slight turn in our conversation here. These two systems working in the background in our heads, they're a normal built-in mechanism that has done us well through evolution. But sometimes they might become dysregulated. They get out of control. So when they go into overdrive, would that be behind things like superstitions or people being convinced they have bad karma?
There is some evidence that people who are especially likely to detect agents where maybe there aren't any also have beliefs that we might think of as more superstitious. So yes, there is some evidence of that. I want to be clear that the account that cognitive scientists of religion and I as one of those have developed isn't really about individual variability on these things, but it has inspired some psychologists to look at that individual variability kind of issue. And yes, it seems that if we're too concerned about agency, we're finding agents everywhere that can lead to certain kinds of paranoias. It can lead to it's associated with certain kinds of delusions. And the tendency, and there's sort of some in the neighborhood tendencies to sort of over ritualize in defense of maybe these unseen agents that are around. And somehow I need to patrol the boundaries around my safe spaces to keep them out or to keep them happy. And that can lead to some scrupulosity or other kinds of obsessive compulsive types of behaviors. So yes, there is at least some speculation and starting to be some threads of evidence that when these systems get sort of amped up too greatly, you get some pretty peculiar beliefs.
Is scrupulosity, is that the same as what I thought was hyper-religiosity? And maybe related to that, I've been in circles where people just saw demons around every corner.
Not being an expert in scrupulosity, I don't want to say too much, but I think it's this, you might think of it as a bit like obsessive compulsive behaviors of a religious sort.
Okay.
And one feature of this could be I'm seeing demons and other kinds of threats everywhere. But then because of that, I need to do X, Y, and Z, right? So I need to engage in these kinds of, so I'm going to be blessing my house repeatedly, maybe with holy oil, and I'm going to play worship and praise music in all the rooms of my house for so many hours of every day. And I might say it's so I'm keeping spirits out,
right?
Because they're a constant threat. Yeah.
Okay. And what about the flip side to this? We're talking about the HAD, promiscuous teleology system, being out of control. What if that whole system is broken and people are unable to find or sense the divine? This can happen to devout believers who develop Alzheimer's, I understand. They find that their religious experience is degraded or even lost. But could this also be what's behind atheism? Is atheism a dysfunction or a maladaptation of this pathway?
I want to be careful here because I think there are multiple pathways to atheism. If we're thinking about moving from religiosity of some sort to atheism, there are lots of different pathways, right? And there'll be different accounts of why somebody remains an atheist if they're in a largely atheist kind of cultural context. So I just want to signal that. There is some evidence suggesting that people who are weaker in what's sometimes called this theory of mind or mindedness kind of thinking, they're less likely to think about the beliefs and intentions of agents around them. They're more likely to treat agents just like objects. Okay. So that system seems to be impaired in some way, or at least it's, on the low side. There's some evidence to think that such people are less likely to be enthusiastic sort of believers. There is a connection, at least some evidence for a connection of a weak sort. And I think it's of a weak sort because there are other pathways into organized religion. So you might think your typical case of this impairment would be someone on the autism spectrum. So people with autism, at least one of the features of autism that's very common and talked about a lot is the, not really paying as much attention to people's mental states. Agency is not as important as, order and structure in some ways, as we see in neurotypical kind of, as it's called, population. But the ritualization of organized religion can be very attractive to the same autistic individuals. That creates a nice, predictable kind of structure to engage in. And so there's this other pathway into those faith communities other than just the, I'm forming beliefs about unseen agents and what their beliefs and desires might be. So that's where I think the data to date show only a weak effect between impairments of this sort and religious participation. Where we might expect to see it stronger is in areas like non-standard religious beliefs. We'd be much more surprised to see somebody with severe impairments of their theory of mind to be constantly seeing ghosts and sort of that sort of thing around. I'm not aware of those studies being done. So this is maybe somebody out there will do these studies because that I think is a reasonable hypothesis.
Okay, so now probably the most important question that I want to ask in this interview. What we've done so far is come up with a scientific or naturalistic explanation for religion. So does this explain away or undermine faith?
Good question. The quick answer is not, as far as I can tell.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, I don't want to be too glib about this because I think there are going to be very specific religious beliefs that we ought to at least that the responsible thing to do in light of the evidence is to pause and think, well, does this make me rethink the evidence for such belief commitments? And it may be that the answer is yes. And so I don't want to be too quick. But at least so far, there's no emerging consensus that by the philosophers who are looking at these sorts of explanations, most seem to be coming down on it's not really clear that this explains away at all. And it's not hard to see why they're not enthusiastic about that. Because really all we're saying is that for a set of beliefs and practices that are very common across cultures and throughout time, there are characteristic kinds of explanations for where these things came from. Well, that would be true of me believing that there's an external world, that right now I'm talking to a minded being, that my mother loves me, that donuts are tasty, that all kinds of things in life, right? If we are optimistic about science, we expect, and we're going to come up with explanations, partial explanations, but we're going to come up with explanations for why these are tendencies in me or tendencies in populations. And that doesn't automatically make them suspect. That just means that however we form our beliefs, it's going to be through our regular cognitive apparatus, right?
Right.
So we can even think of these really ecstatic religious experiences when somebody says, hey, I've identified this part of the brain that was active when people are having this kind of religious experience. And usually my response to that is, well, that's kind of cool and interesting, but I always suspected that part of the brain was active. It would be shocking if the brain wasn't active.
Exactly.
That would be the surprising thing, not that, okay, you've narrowed it down from the whole brain to this part of the brain. That's interesting, but that doesn't say, so you shouldn't believe it, or it's not real, or so it's not good. So I think that there's a confusion going on here, that just because you have an explanation of a scientific sort, and then the contents of those beliefs suddenly are defeated. Well, there are folks working on the science of atheism right now, and they're coming up with interesting explanations. There are going to be scientific explanations for why some people are atheists and some people aren't. That's not going to help us solve the question of who's right.
Exactly. I think philosophers refer to this as a genetic fallacy.
Correct, yeah.
I want to remind the listeners that we talked about this 3 weeks ago with Jeffrey Schloss, and he talked about the belief pill. So you might want to take a look at that. But Justin, could those evolutionary developments have been part of God's creative process? That we were made with promiscuous teleology to look for him, and a had in order to find him? Could these two characteristics have been created or designed or stimulated within us to draw us to something bigger, something important?
I am currently of the view that God put into human cognitive systems little tendencies, encouragements to look beyond our natural world and our sort of human constructions to find meaning, to find something bigger, to ultimately find him. Theologians have used different terms for this kind of natural tendency. John Calvin called this the sensus divinitatis. And there's debate over exactly what the sensus divinitatis or sense of the divine is, how specific it is, and so forth. But I do think that the cognitive science of religion and some of these related areas of evolutionary studies of religion are providing independent evidence for something at least a little bit like that. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying yes. I think God could have done that, and it's not unreasonable to think that God would embed in us those tendencies, just like he's embedded into us certain kinds of moral intuitions, as vague and as fallen and broken as they are, that there's something still there, that our affinity towards others, our impulse to care, our tendency to love and be loved, to seek that out, that these are also built into us in some ways. And so I'm not a bit surprised if this is part of God's design package.
Okay, so for those listeners who might be against these ideas simply because they don't see them reflected in the Bible, there's a passage in Paul's letter to the Romans that comes to mind here. Romans chapter 8. I'm just going to very quickly pull out a few phrases. Creation groaning in anticipation, as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Creation being liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. When I read that, I wonder if this is part of this, some of the things that we're talking about here. Could Paul's words, creation being subject to bondage and decay, couldn't we today call that entropy and thermodynamics? And Paul's using childbirth as a metaphor for something the arrival, the emergence of what? He's talking about the goal of that metaphorical childbirth being creation being liberated and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So could we take that to be referring to the biological tree of life on Earth after billions of years of labor pains, species evolving into ever more complex forms until finally it produces hominids, out of which you start to see this God image emerging. And we eventually become fully agape capable beings living in harmony with each other and with the animals and with God. We're not there yet, but we have it in us to get there. So my question then, do I have any warrant for interpreting Paul's statements here in this way?
I'd encourage you to keep thinking in that direction.
Okay.
I find elements of that very attractive. Definitely, there is something reasonable and exciting about the idea that God has used this very long and fascinating kind of process to bring about this very special kind of animal that has the right conceptual tools, the right sort of native tendencies in some ways to form a special kind of relationship with him, to enjoy this actual personal relationship with God. All of creation has a relationship with God, but in humans, there's an animal that can do it in a different kind of way, that can freely love and be loved or reject. Part of that freedom is to reject it. And that's part of God's creative story here. And then we read in, Genesis 1, 2, 3, that humans also have been special responsibilities as that special animal in creation. And one of the things that I find fascinating and motivating about doing this kind of study in cognitive science of religion and just human cognitive development more generally is I see all of these various pieces of what seem to mark us out as being human as being exactly the same ones that sort of lead us to relationship with God. And so that seems suggestive to me anyway. So
Right.
yes, I encourage you to keep thinking in these ways.
Okay. So we've gone on very long with time here. Last comments. Did we miss anything that you think needs to be said on this subject?
Oh, I think you did a really nice job of weaving it together in a way that I actually is a little bit unusual too. So it helps bring out other dimensions that most folks I talk to don't bring out. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Now you've got a new book, Thriving with Stone Age Minds. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, this was a project long coming in that for I don't know, it started probably 15, 20 years ago. I started talking to people like Jeffrey Schloss, who you had on, about, hey, is there a nice introduction to evolutionary psychology for Christians that we can understand what's going on there, what's the good, what's the bad, and everything else in a real fair-minded way, not in a dismissive way, but in a fair-minded way. And we weren't aware of a resource of that sort. So I tried to get him to write it, and Schloss, that is, and he just wouldn't do it. So eventually I broke down and thought, well, I'll write it, but I'm not going to write it as an apology for evolutionary psychology. I'm going to take evolutionary psychology as I understand it and apply it to a problem that we Christ followers care about. And that is, what's human flourishing? What does it mean to thrive in the world? And why does it seem so hard sometimes? And can evolutionary psychology give us new insights? How far can we use evolutionary psychology to make sense of that problem? And what are its limitations? And so that's kind of what the book is about. Thriving with Stone Age Minds is borrowing this idea that from an evolutionary perspective, the minds we have are pretty ancient, but we're suddenly in these these contemporary worlds that are changing very quickly and maybe creating friction between our nature and the demands around us, and that can present some obstacles for our thriving and flourishing. But to give away sort of, the punchline in some ways, evolutionary psychology by itself doesn't give us good grounds for understanding, well, what is our purpose? What does it mean to thrive? For that, we need to turn to Christian theology, or at least some kind of theology. So with Pam King, I'm trying to put those, my collaborator on that project, trying to put some Christian theology and evolutionary psychology together. And
any other projects in the pipeline?
Oh, so many. One of the things that we've been working on at Blueprint 1543 is really just introducing theologians to more psychological science that could be useful for doing theology. So we've been doing a lot of training and other kinds of workshopping with theologians. And we're starting to look at the flip side of how can we help scientists who work especially in the human sciences become more eager and equipped for maybe engaging with theological topics, so that we can start, breaking down the wall between what's usually done in the sciences and what's usually done in the theological spaces.
I'm going to leave links in the show notes for this episode that will link our listeners to your webpage at Blueprint 1543, and you've got a couple other websites. I'll link them in at that point. So, Justin, Dr. Barrett, thank you so much again for sharing your expertise, your vast knowledge on the subject. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Okay. Have a great weekend, Justin.
All right. You too. Bye now.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with me, your host, Luke Jansen. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join a private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help this podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review rating at your favorite podcast catcher.